The call came on a Tuesday evening, while I was still in my work boots. My son had phoned, not stopped by, not sent a message through my daughter-in-law, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to soften something, but actually called, which already told me something was different. His voice had that polished quality it had developed over the past few years, the one that sounded like he'd taken lessons in sounding important. "Dad," he said, "I want you to come to dinner next Saturday. The firm is celebrating my partnership. It's at the Rosewater Supper Club downtown." I knew the Rosewater. Everyone in Toronto knew the Rosewater. It was the kind of place where the menu didn't have prices on it, which always struck me as either the height of elegance or the height of arrogance, depending on your mood. "Of course," I said, "I'll be there." There was a brief pause. "It's a formal event, Dad. Black tie. Just so you know." "I know what formal means, son." Another pause. Shorter. "Right. Okay. See you Saturday." He hung up before I could say anything else. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter and looked around the house. The same house I'd lived in for 31 years. The same house where I'd taught my son to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning helping him with his economics thesis, where I'd handed him a check for $40,000 without blinking when he needed a down payment on his first condo. The kitchen was ordinary. The counters were a little worn. The linoleum needed replacing. I knew that. I'd been meaning to get to it. But the house was paid for. Twice over, in a sense. My name is Patrick Doyle. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years building a commercial plumbing company from absolutely nothing. 2 vans, 1 apprentice, and a contract with a strip mall in Mississauga into something that now employs over 200 people across Ontario and handles large-scale institutional contracts. Hospitals, universities, government buildings. When my son was growing up, he knew we were comfortable, but he didn't know the specifics. I'd kept it that way on purpose. My own father had come from nothing, had worked himself to exhaustion to give us a decent life, and I'd watched what happened when kids grew up knowing exactly how much was in the bank. They stopped trying. They stopped needing to. So my son, James, grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, went to a good school, never wanted for anything important, but also never had a number attached to his father's name. He knew I ran a plumbing company. He knew we were fine. That was enough for him to know. He'd done well for himself regardless. Law degree from Osgood. Corporate finance work at a mid-sized firm in the financial district. He was sharp, driven, and he'd earned his partnership legitimately. I was proud of him. I genuinely was. His wife, Amanda, was a different story, but that's getting ahead of things. I drove myself to the Rosewater on Saturday in my truck. It was a 2019 Ram. Not new, not flashy, but solid and clean. I'd thought about taking a cab, but I didn't see the need. I parked 2 blocks away because I knew the restaurant would have valet service and I'd never been comfortable with strangers driving my vehicles. I walked the 2 blocks in a suit I'd had since my youngest daughter's wedding 4 years ago. It still fit. It was a good suit, charcoal wool, properly tailored. I didn't look like I'd just come from a construction site. I looked like a man going to dinner. The evening was cold the way Toronto gets in late October. Not brutal yet, but purposeful. The kind of cold that means business. I turned up my collar and walked. The front of the Rosewater had a canopy and 2 men in dark coats managing the door. I approached and gave my name. One of them checked a tablet, frowned slightly, checked again, and then nodded. "Of course, Mr. Doyle. James Doyle's party is in the Laurier room. I'll have someone show you up." A young woman in a black dress led me through the main dining room and up a staircase. The Laurier room was a private event space on the 2nd floor, maybe 40 people in it, white tablecloths, low lighting, a string quartet in the far corner playing something I didn't recognize. I scanned the room. James was near the bar with 2 men I didn't know, laughing at something. He was in a tuxedo, and he looked good in it. He'd grown into his face in his 30s, the way some men do. I felt the pull of ordinary fatherly pride, the kind that doesn't depend on anything except the fact that this person came from you and turned out whole. Amanda saw me before James did. She was standing with a cluster of women near a high-top table, holding a glass of champagne. When she spotted me, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like calculation. She excused herself from the group and came toward me with the particular smile she'd developed over the years that meant she was managing a situation. "Patrick," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "You made it. Wouldn't have missed it. James will be glad." She glanced down at my suit, then back up, and the smile held but tightened slightly. "Can I get you a drink?" "The bar is open." "I'll get something in a minute. I want to say hello to James first." She touched my arm lightly. "He's just in the middle of something with a couple of the senior partners. Maybe give him a few minutes?" I gave him a few minutes. I found a spot at the edge of the room and watched the way people moved through a party like this. The women were in floor-length gowns. The men were in tuxedos. There were a lot of very white teeth and a lot of very careful laughter. I'd been to events like this before, not this specific world, but functions with developers and city officials and hospital board members, and I'd always found them manageable. You just had to understand that the performance was the point. Everyone there was performing a version of themselves they'd worked very hard to construct. I understood that. I just didn't find it particularly interesting. James came over after about 15 minutes. He hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that's mostly shoulders, and said it was good I could make it. "Wouldn't have missed it," I said, the same thing I'd said to Amanda. "You look fine," he said, and there was something in the word fine that I noticed. Not good, not sharp. Fine. "The suit's 4 years old," I said, "but it holds up." He nodded, and his eyes moved briefly across the room in that way people's eyes do at their own parties, constantly tracking, constantly managing. "There are a lot of people I want to introduce you to tonight, Dad. Just follow my lead, okay? I think I can manage a dinner, son." He smiled. "I know. It's an important night." "I know it is. I'm proud of you." Something crossed his face at that. Something that might have been guilt briefly, before the party version of himself came back. "Thanks, Dad. Come on. Let me get you a drink." We sat for dinner at 7:30. I was seated at a round table near the window, good placement actually, which surprised me. James and Amanda were at the central table with the senior partners and their wives, which made sense. I was at a table with 2 other couples I didn't know, a radiologist and his wife from Forest Hill, and a couple who'd met at the University of Western Ontario and now ran competing marketing firms and seemed to find that funny. They were all perfectly pleasant. We talked about the usual things: real estate, traffic on the Gardner, whether the Leafs had any real shot this season. I had the salmon. The radiologist's wife told me about their renovation project in Muskoka. I told her a bit about my company, leaving out most of the specifics the way I always do, and she nodded politely and said that sounded like important work. It was a generous thing to say. I liked her. The problem started after the main course, during the speeches. One of the senior partners, a tall man with silver hair named Whitmore, I'd caught his name from introductions, stood up and said some words about the firm, about excellence, about what it meant to bring someone into partnership. It was a well-crafted speech. He'd given versions of it before, you could tell, but he'd personalized it enough that it didn't feel recycled. Then Amanda stood up. I hadn't expected Amanda to speak. I don't know why I hadn't. She was always comfortable performing, always at her best when she had an audience arranged in front of her. She smoothed her dress, lifted her champagne glass, and smiled around the room with the warm confidence of someone who had rehearsed casual. "I just want to say a few words," she began, "because I think it's important to acknowledge not just James's professional achievement tonight, but his personal journey." She talked about how hard he'd worked, about the early mornings and the late nights, about what it meant to rise in a field as competitive as corporate finance. All of it was true. All of it was fine. Then she said, "James didn't have the advantages that some of his colleagues had. He didn't grow up in a home where Bay Street was the dinner table conversation." She paused, and the pause was deliberate, the pause of someone who has timed what comes next. He came from simpler beginnings, and it took real determination to shed that, to stop letting where he came from hold him back, to leave the weight of that behind and build something new. There was a moment of applause starting to form, and then she looked directly at me. "Tonight isn't just about a promotion," she said. "Tonight is about how far James has come from everything that could have kept him small." The applause came properly then. James raised his glass. People turned to look at him, and a few of them glanced toward our table, toward me, and then quickly away again, the way people look away from something uncomfortable. I sat very still. The radiologist beside me said something quiet. I think it was well. That was something, and his wife touched his arm. The couple from Western Ontario had gone very interested in their dessert plates. I picked up my water glass and drank from it slowly. My hands were steady. I'd spent 35 years on job sites with men who didn't respect the work until they saw what happened when the work stopped, and I'd learned a long time ago that the first person who reacts loses the frame. So I didn't react. I set my glass down. I cut a small piece of the chocolate torte they'd served for dessert. I ate it. It was excellent. Actually dark chocolate, barely sweet, with a layer of something orange-flavored in the middle. And then, when the conversation at the table had picked back up and the room had moved on to the next thing, I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and stood up. The radiologist's wife glanced at me. "Early morning," I said quietly. She nodded. I didn't go to James's table. I didn't want a scene. He was laughing at something one of the partners had said, his hand resting on Amanda's chair back, and he looked, and I say this without cruelty, completely at ease, completely comfortable, like a man who had successfully completed a project. I walked out of the Rosewater, collected my coat from the check, and stepped out into the October cold. I walked the 2 blocks to my truck. I sat in it for a few minutes without starting the engine. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something more like recognition. The particular recognition of seeing something clearly that you'd been choosing not to look at directly for a long time. Like finally turning to face a window you'd been keeping your back to. I drove home. What Amanda didn't know, what James, I suspect, had also either forgotten or chosen to stop thinking about, was who I actually was in the context of the building where he worked. Here's what I mean by that. The firm where James had just made partner, Calvert Whitmore Associates, occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a tower on Bay Street. That tower was owned by a holding company called Lakeview Capital Properties. Lakeview had 2 principal investors. One was a real estate developer named Forsyth. The other was me. I'd taken a stake in Lakeview 11 years ago as part of a settlement when the commercial tenant in a building we'd done extensive contract work for defaulted on our invoices. The developer had offered equity instead of cash. I'd taken it. It had been a good decision. Lakeview had grown considerably in the decades since, and my stake, which I'd added to twice when the opportunity was right, was now substantial. Beyond that, Calvert Whitmore Associates had used our firm for the plumbing infrastructure on 2 of their office renovations in the previous 8 years. Those contracts had been handled at the project management level, not the executive level, so James had no particular reason to connect the company name Doyle Commercial Services with his own last name. He'd never asked about the specifics of my business. He'd stopped asking, I think, sometime in his mid-20s when he'd decided that the specifics weren't impressive enough to bother with. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it explains what happened next. On the Monday morning after the dinner, I called my lawyer. Her name is Susan Achterberg, and she has been my legal counsel for 14 years. I told her what had happened at the dinner. I told her what Amanda had said, and how it had been said. I told her I wasn't looking for any kind of dramatic intervention. I just wanted to understand my options regarding the Lakeview stake, and whether there were any active matters connecting my business to James's firm. Susan listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about her. Then she said, "Patrick, you know I'm going to tell you to sleep on this for a week before you make any decisions." "I know. I'm sleeping on it. I'm also asking the question." She walked me through it. The Lakeview stake was entirely within my discretion to manage as I chose. There were no active contracts between Doyle Commercial and Calvert Whitmore at present, though there was a preliminary conversation underway about a 3rd renovation project. The firm was expanding onto a partial 3rd floor. That conversation was at a very early stage, and nothing had been signed. What would it mean, I asked, if we quietly stepped back from that conversation? "It would mean the renovation project goes to another contractor," Susan said. "And it might raise some questions internally at Calvert Whitmore about why." "Questions," I said, "have a way of going somewhere." "They do," she agreed. I told her I'd be in touch. I didn't call James that week. He didn't call me either. The following Wednesday, I had a lunch meeting with Forsyth, the other principal in Lakeview, about a separate matter involving a property in Hamilton. Afterward, as we were putting on our coats, he mentioned that he'd heard the expansion at Calvert Whitmore might be more significant than originally planned. A full third floor, possibly a fourth eventually. It'd be a major fit-out, he said. Good work for someone. It would be, I said. He looked at me. Forsyth had known me for a long time. He had a way of reading a room that I'd always found useful in a partner. Something going on with that file? He asked. Nothing decided, I said. I'm just thinking. He nodded and left it there. The call from James came on a Friday, about 2.5 weeks after the dinner. I was at my desk when my assistant put him through. His voice, when he spoke, had lost the polished quality. It sounded like him, the way he'd sounded at 22, uncertain in a specific way that used to come out when he was in trouble and had run out of other options. Dad, he said, I need to talk to you. All right. Something's happened at the firm. A pause. There's been a change in the building ownership situation. Or not a change, exactly. A development. And it's connected to you. In a way I didn't understand until this week. Okay, I said. I waited. Dad. His voice was careful now. Careful the way you are when you're navigating something and you're not sure where the solid ground is. Are you involved with Lakeview Capital? I have a stake in Lakeview, yes. I have for about 11 years. The silence on the line was long enough that I could hear his breathing. Why didn't you ever tell me? I thought about how to answer that. There were several true answers. I chose the simplest one. You never asked about my business, son. Not really. Not for a long time. Another silence. Then, Calvert Whitmore is being approached about the renovation contract. And apparently there's a conversation happening at the ownership level about the direction they want to take on that. One of the partners told me this morning that the preliminary discussions have gone quiet on the contractor side. They're not sure why. He stopped. Dad, did you? I haven't made any decisions, I said. I've been thinking. He repeated it the way people repeat a word when they're trying to understand what it's holding. About a few things, I said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Dad, I need you to know that what happened at the dinner. James, I need to say this. All right. Say it. What Amanda said wasn't I didn't know she was going to say that. I want you to know that. I heard it, and I didn't. He stopped. I could hear him collecting himself. I didn't say anything. I didn't stand up. I sat there, and I didn't say a word, and I've been thinking about that every day since. I should have stood up. I let that sit. Why didn't you? I asked. The pause before his answer was the kind of pause that contains a real answer, not a managed one. Because I was embarrassed, he said. Not of you, of myself. Of the fact that she was saying it, and I was just letting it happen. I was scared of making a scene in front of the partners, which is I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, I said. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. Not because of the contract or the Lakeview thing, I need you to believe that. I'm sorry because you drove to that dinner by yourself, and you sat there, and you listened to that, and you walked out without saying a word. And I knew what it was, and I didn't. James, I said, yeah, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Not the version of the answer that solves the problem. The honest one. Okay. What do you actually think about where you came from? The pause this time was even longer. I could hear traffic faintly on his end, which meant he'd gone somewhere private to make this call, probably stepped outside. It was still cold. I could almost hear the October air. I think, he said slowly, that I spent a long time trying to make it mean nothing, because I thought it made me look less serious to the people I was trying to impress. And I think somewhere along the way I stopped. I stopped keeping track of what I was actually doing. It just became automatic. And Amanda? He exhaled. Amanda has a very particular idea about what success means and who gets to have it, and I let that become my idea too, without really noticing. That's honest, I said. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. No, I said, it's not, but it's a start. There's a moment in most serious conversations between fathers and sons, the kind of conversation that has weight to it, the kind that's been building for years where you reach a fork. One path is the one that feels satisfying in the moment. You say the hard thing fully. You let the wound breathe. You make the other person understand exactly what they cost you. The other path is longer and less immediately satisfying, but it's the one that doesn't end the relationship. I've made mistakes in my life. I've been proud when I should have been practical. I've let work swallow up time that should have gone to my kids. I'm not a man who comes to the table without his own ledger. James and I talked for another hour that afternoon. Not about the contract, not about Lakeview, about things that had been sitting between us for years, the way he'd drifted from calling regularly, the way I'd let the distance go without naming it, the way Amanda's world had slowly become his reference point for everything that mattered. Neither of us was clean. That's the thing about honest conversations. They tend to be equal opportunity in what they expose. I didn't promise him anything about the contract or the Lakeview situation that day. I told him I needed some more time to think. He said he understood. Before we hung up, he said, "Dad, can I bring the kids over on Sunday? Lily keeps asking about you. She wants to show you something she built in school." Lily was 6. She'd started an after-school robotics club at her elementary school, which I'd thought was remarkable for a 6-year-old until her teacher explained they made things out of cardboard and craft sticks, which somehow made it more remarkable to me, not less. "Sunday's fine," I said. "I'll make chili." Amanda came on Sunday. She looked like she'd spent the drive over-preparing, the way athletes warm up before competition. When she walked in, she had a kind of composed preemptiveness to her. She was ready to manage whatever she walked into. I let her settle. I gave her a coffee and didn't make it easy or hard. When the kids had gone into the backyard with James, she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Patrick, I want to apologize for what I said at the dinner. I expressed things badly." "You expressed them clearly," I said. "That's a different problem." She met my eyes. Amanda was not a person who backed down easily, and I'd always actually respected that about her even when I didn't like its applications. I was trying to celebrate how far James has come. "I didn't mean to make you feel... Amanda." I said her name the way I said it when I needed her to stop managing the conversation. "I've been in business for 35 years. I understand exactly what you were doing, and I understand why. What I'm interested in is what you actually think." A long pause. Outside, Lily was explaining something to James in a very loud and serious voice. Something about load-bearing angles. "I think," Amanda said finally, "that I got very comfortable with a story about James and where he was going. And the story had a villain, and it was easier to have it be circumstances, a background, than to examine whether the story was even accurate." "Was it?" She set her coffee mug down. "No," she said. "It wasn't fair. To you, specifically. It wasn't a full apology. It was a partial one, intelligently delivered by a person who was still thinking carefully about every word. But it was also, I suspected, as close to genuine as Amanda could get in one conversation, and there was something in it that I believed." "Okay," I said. "Okay?" She looked uncertain. "Okay, that's a start. I'm not going to pretend we're all fine by Sunday dinner, but okay." She nodded. She seemed to be recalibrating slightly, the way people do when a situation doesn't follow the script they prepared for. Outside, Lily had apparently succeeded in explaining whatever needed explaining, because there was a burst of laughter from the backyard, high and clear in the cold air. James's laugh, and then Lily's, tangling together. I got up to add more water to the chili pot. I eventually told Susan to let the Calvert-Whitmore renovation conversation proceed. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and not as a gesture of forgiveness exactly, which would have been a bit theatrical for my taste. Mostly because the project was a good project, and my involvement in it was a business decision, and I try not to let one thing contaminate another, if I can help it. What I did do was have a direct conversation with Forsyth about rebalancing some of the Lakeview portfolio decisions over the next fiscal year. Forsyth, who had known me for long enough to know when I was and wasn't explaining everything, didn't push for details. He said, "You want more visibility in the decision-making on the Bay Street properties going forward." I said yes. He said fine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a punishment. It was just a clarification of something that had been, until recently, invisible. The way a lot of things become visible when you stop being polite about them. Lily showed me what she'd built at school. It was a small bridge made from popsicle sticks and paper clips, and what appeared to be a significant quantity of masking tape. She held it out with both hands and explained that it could hold 17 pennies before it started to bend. That's impressive engineering, I said. She considered this. Dad says engineering is for people who are good at math, she said. But my teacher says engineering is for people who like figuring things out. Your teacher is right, I said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and set her bridge carefully on the kitchen table next to the chili bowls. James, across the table, looked at me. Not the polished look. The other one. The one that was just him. He looked like he was 35 years old and starting something over, which was, in my experience, not the worst place to be. The chili's good, Dad, he said. It's the same chili I've been making since you were 8, I said. I know, he said. That's why it's good. We ate. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the October light was going sideways through the neighbors' maples, turning everything briefly orange and gold before the dark came in. It was the kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look like they mean something. I suppose sometimes they do. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since that October dinner. Not in any mystical sense. I'm too old and too practical for that, but in the plainest mechanical sense. The way one thing leads to another. The way decisions accumulate quietly over years, and then surface all at once in a single room, a single sentence, a single moment where the air goes out of everything. Amanda made a choice when she stood up at that dinner. She chose a story over a person. She'd been making that choice in smaller ways for years, in the way she talked about James's journey, in the way she quietly repositioned his past as something he'd heroically escaped, rather than something that had shaped him into someone worth knowing. The dinner was just the moment when that story got said out loud, in public, with people watching. And James made a choice too. He sat there and he let it happen. That one cost me more, if I'm honest. Not because I need my son to fight my battles, but because there's a version of integrity that isn't about grand gestures, it's about the small moments when you either speak or you don't. He didn't speak, and he knew it, which is why the call came when it did, in that uncertain voice I hadn't heard since he was 22. What I keep coming back to is this. The consequences that found James and Amanda weren't punishments I engineered. They were just the natural weight of what had been ignored for too long. I hadn't hidden my business out of strategy. I'd kept it private because James had never asked, and that incuriosity was its own answer about where he'd put his attention. When the Lakeview connection surfaced, it surfaced because reality doesn't stay invisible forever. It has a way of becoming visible exactly when you've most committed to not seeing it. I think that's what intelligence actually looks like in practice. Not cleverness, not credentials, but the willingness to stay curious about the people in front of you, to keep asking. James is a sharp man. He always has been. But somewhere in the climb, he'd confused, knowing a lot about certain things with knowing the people who mattered most. Those are completely different skills, and the second one requires a kind of humility that success, if you're not careful, quietly erodes. The resilience part took me longer to understand about myself. I walked out of that dinner and drove home in the cold, and I sat in my truck for a few minutes, and then I made myself a cup of tea, and I went to bed. That's not toughness in any dramatic sense. It's just the accumulated practice of not letting the hardest moments be the last word. I'd built something over 35 years, and I'd built it one ordinary decision at a time, in the cold, with work boots on, without an audience. That kind of history doesn't vanish because someone calls it deadweight at a dinner party. Lily's bridge held 17 pennies before it started to bend. She told me this like it was a fact of enormous importance. She was right. Everything that holds weight buildings, families, the longer version of a relationship between a father and a son, is built the same way, carefully, with attention to the structure underneath, not the surface. I still make the same chili. It still takes most of a Sunday afternoon. That part hasn't changed, and I don't expect it to.